I begin today somewhat autobiographically, situating my comments in the context of my hometown. In his recently published book, Midwest Futures, Phil Chrisman problematizes the image of the Midwest and Midwesterners as normal, describing the part of the country often considered as a collection of mere flyover states as deeply complex. Indiana, my own home state, is not only the land of David Letterman and John Mellencamp, but was also the center of the revival of the KKK in the 20s. More specifically, even, the small town that straddles the border of Indiana and Illinois, where my great-grandfather Zac Karanovich eventually settled, along with a number of other Serbian immigrants drawn to work in the coal mines, was a sundown town. Whether all of Blandford's residents were on board with such explicit anti-Black racism is less of an issue when juxtaposed with those who simply did not take issue with it. As Chrisman says of communities like this, if American history proves anything, it is that a core of committed racists will always beat a large crowd of non-committal non-racists. Communities like mine are complex and in many ways paradoxical, and while my diagnosis of this paradox, following from some thinkers much brighter than I, is certainly an overgeneralization, I do believe that it at least serves to make much more difficult our desire to facilely lay blame upon a particular group. Arlie Russell Hochschild, author of Strangers in Their Own Land, concluded after her in-depth study of a rural working-class white community in Louisiana that the complex and contradictory value systems in communities like my own were built upon their deep story. In Hochschild's view, all of us have a deep story. Regardless of its grounding in fact, she writes, the deep story is a feels as if story. It's the story feelings tell in the language of symbols. It removes judgment, it removes fact, it tells us how things feel. As she explains it, the deep story is a response of both nostalgia and frustration. There is both a sense of the way things were, typified by the tenets of the American dream, as well as the keenly felt awareness that things are no longer functioning that way. And the deep story is a piece of evidence upon which people buttress their actions. Very briefly, the deep story that Hochschild writes goes something like this, edited for time. You're patiently standing in a long line stretching toward the American dream, but people are cutting in line ahead of you. Black beneficiaries of affirmative action or welfare, immigrants, Mexicans, Somalis, the Syrian refugees. You're being asked to feel sorry for them. You have a good heart, but Democrats are deciding who you should feel compassion for. The government has become an instrument for redistributing your money to the undeserving. It's not your government anymore, it's theirs. The central concept within these deep stories is the American dream. But Nancy Eisenberg argues in her book, White Trash, that the myth of the American dream is both a product of and further supports ongoing educational oppression, economic exploitation, and political manipulation. Continuing my overgeneralization, then one could say that the American dream first oppressed the oppressors, again, in overgeneralization and probably a poor use of categories. What this illustrates is that these communities made up of good people, they are my family and friends after all, who nonetheless hold deeply troubling and often patently false values and beliefs, which for some are stories too deep for them to be conscious of, are much too complex to simply dispose of or to cancel. It is a troubling and destabilizing cognitive dissonance. Chrisman writes, the picture postcard city where neighbors pitch in during the storm and the sundown town are the same place. One does not disprove the other. One is not the underbelly of the other. We have to reckon with both simultaneously, or we must admit to being both simultaneously. While not unique to those of us raised in the Midwest, many of us were unaware of the problematic beliefs some of our loved ones held. It was not until we moved away, either for work or school, that we were in a position that could facilitate a conversion, intellectual or moral, for example, that revealed that what we were taught was not all true, let alone good. After all, for many, moving away is accompanied by drastic changes. Worldviews expand, politics change, and faith develops and challenges them to engage society differently. One often leaves behind a value system, at least in part, that can never again be accepted. As a result, return migration happens less, especially among those who perceive their home communities as less inclusive. And while these threshold crossings can provide the circumstances in which one can be more open to grace and conversion, it can also lead to the breakdown in their relationships with those whom they left, those who may still hold to the old value system. Thomas Merton, however, challenges the temptations to these breakdowns. Merton's life is a story of conversions marked by the renunciation of certain aspects of his life that permitted his growth as he progressed toward an ever truer self. But eventually he was concerned not with allowing conversion to be accompanied by contempt. Renunciation, he argued, should not include resentment. Instead, the progress toward the true self necessarily includes a concern for others, seeking unity by critical self-examination, honest and authentic relationship, and loving witness. While grace is certainly necessary for the success of this unitive project, Merton asserted that persons were not helpless. Action is possible. In light of this context, in this paper, I argue that Thomas Merton offers the means to better understand human nature and to address the rifts that occur between individuals, especially those that arise between family and friends whose values eventually diverge, in a way that does not produce a new stranger, but that instead facilitates the possibility of greater unity. I will do so in three basic moves. First, I will establish the impossibility of a stranger in Merton's writing. Then I will describe Merton's theological anthropology and how this anthropology is further illustrated in his spiritual and political writing. And finally, I will explore how Merton's contributions provide a path to renunciation without resentment, or conversion without contempt, and how we can avoid creating new strangers. In his brief essay, Day of a Stranger, Merton describes his time in the hermitage as his attempt to understand himself in light of his rejection of the myth of progress and technological advancement devoid of ethical reflection, which render human persons as automatons and estranged from themselves. The stranger in this essay is Merton himself, the one about whom the inquirer who prompted Merton's writing the piece and Merton have some unfamiliarity. As Patrick O'Connell wrote, he is a stranger in the sense that he is aware that his identity, like that of everyone, is a mystery that cannot be defined by a role or function. The second work in which Merton elaborates on the term stranger is within Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander. And in it, Merton describes the famous vision in Louisville in which he underwent a conversion, a switch flip that initiated a process of transformation that unveiled the earlier false or inaccurate understanding of his monastic vocation and showed him a deeper truth about humanity. Instead of being the escape from the world that he thought going to the monastery offered him, such a separation did not take place because that type of separation cannot take place. He was not removed from the world in the monastery, but had merely joined those who have made a profession out of their consciousness that they and everyone else belong to God. Merton acknowledged that grace brought about this conversion, and he was awakened to the revealed intimacy of humanity, a knowledge infused or poured in by God. It is not that it did not exist before, but that he wasn't able to see it in that new way. Nor was it a realization just about his own existence, but about everyone's. He writes, "My solitude, however, is not my own, for I see now how much it belongs to them, and that I have a responsibility for it in their regard, not just in my own. It is because I am with them that I owe it to them to be alone. And when I am alone, they are not they, but my own self. There are no strangers." Distinct from the use above in Day of a Stranger, Merton's use of stranger here is a theological category, and he asserts that strangers do not exist. Instead, there is a unity among humanity and with God, making all essentially one. Yet, while Merton disavows the existence of strangers, we can be estranged from God, neighbor, ourselves. But this estrangement is not a category of being distinct from essential unity, it just obscures it. Merton laments that the whole world cannot see what he saw, that essential unity. It can only be believed and understood, he says. He indicates, though, that one can prepare for such a gift, in the same way the monastery was his preparation. In engaging the solitude of the monastery for them, he became aware of his identity in connection with everyone else's, which calls him into deeper service of others. And the foundation is laid for his essential anthropological claim, le point vierge. He writes, "At the center of our being is a point of nothingness, which is untouched by sin and by illusion, a point of pure truth, a point or spark which belongs entirely to God, which is never at our disposal, from which God disposes of our lives, which is inaccessible to the fantasies of our own mind or the brutalities of our own will. This little point of nothingness and of absolute poverty is the pure glory of God in us. It is, so to speak, his name written in us, as our poverty, as our indigence, as our dependence, as our sonship. It is like a pure diamond blazing with the invisible light of heaven. It is in everybody. And if we could see it, we would see these billions of points of light coming together in the face and blaze of a sun that would make all darkness and cruelty of life vanish completely. I have no program for seeing this. It is only given, but the gate of heaven is everywhere." The point vierge is a central element of Merton's anthropology, as it is for him what constitutes the unity of human persons with one another and with God. It is what nullifies strangerhood. In addition to the true and false self, with the point vierge, Merton's nesting doll anthropology, if you will, takes shape. From this view of the human person, we can better understand his conception of society and his vision for its repair. Merton's primary concern with the modern world is the way technological progress has rendered the human person a moral infant. Society has given technology complete autonomy and has subjected reason to the rule of quantity, within which the person, the subject of qualified and perfectible freedom, becomes quantified, that is, becomes part of a mass man, he says, whose only function is to enter anonymously into the process of production and consumption. In the battle between can and ought, the can rules as victor, and persons subject themselves to it, rationalizing its results because it has become deified. The God of progress, Merton claims, has rendered our existence as one under a tyranny of untruth, evidenced by the way we submit to the rule of quantity and to plausible and useful lies that help us make sense of something that at its root is contrary to reason. Within us are apparently irreconcilable opposites, the fruits of the conflict between the rule of quantity and the rule of reason. And in an attempt to keep ourselves together, we claim that we desire truth when in actuality, we desire to be right. Within this pseudo-religious structure under the God of progress, in order to maintain our rightness, the rest of the world becomes wrong, to the point that we identify the outer world, other people, other societies, as heretical, malicious, subversive, demonic, Merton says. To buttress our own side, we rely on the emotional use of slogans and political formulas, and the persuasion of power, of quantity, of pressure, of fear, of desire. This conflict between us who value truth and them who are the heretics and demons is actually the manifestation of a battle between our own inner contradictions, despite our purest and most innocent intentions. Merton considers it a sickness of disordered love that realizes itself simultaneously to be self-hate and instantly becomes a source of universal and indiscriminate destructiveness. The consequences of this pseudo-religion are obvious. We are estranged from ourselves, one another, and God. We are, in a sense, strangers to one another, and we cannot, without something more, bridge that divide. The risk of our truth being tainted by contact with error requires that we destroy the bearer of it, and they, of course, think the same about us. Not only is this unsustainable as a social situation, but it gives power to our prejudices, our limitations, our selfishness. Merton parses no words. We are idolaters. We have exchanged the glory of the immortal God for the semblance of the likeness of mortal man. Merton continues in a key passage, since our objectivity, for instance, is in fact an image of ourselves as objective, we soon take our objectivity for granted. And instead of checking the facts, we simply manipulate the facts to fit our pious conviction. If fact seems to conflict with images, then we feel that we are being tempted by the devil, and we determine that we will be all the more blindly loyal to our images. Sadly, Merton's pseudo-religion resonates all too familiarly with the American dream. On its face, the aspirations within the American dream are enviable and inspiring, but the deeper reality, as noted above, but also considering Let America Be America Again by Langston Hughes, for example, whether consciously held or not, reveal a blind faith in the narrative, bending truth and patching holes with propaganda to ensure the narrative holds. And when a person moves away, getting distance from friends and family, and realizes the falsehoods upon which the narrative is built, estrangement is the temptation. We risk making our families and friends into strangers, which, in light of its ultimate impossibility, only serves as the foundation of our own denomination in the larger pseudo-religion. Merton does not believe the only two possible responses are acquiescence or estrangement. Instead, we can work toward a recognition of the unity we all share based on that point vierge. And although Merton claims he provides no program to reach this innermost place, he at least illustrates what it is a person must work through. So while it is true that Merton cannot provide a program to reach the divine spark within us and the perfect unity that would follow, he does provide some program of action to at least approach it. This method can be seen in his writings on spiritual practice and political thought. In consideration of this conversion without contempt, let us first turn to Merton's thought on contemplative prayer. Merton says that contemplation, whose goal is our direct union with God, requires a renunciation of our selfish and limited self in order to discover an inner center of motivation and love, which makes us see ourselves and everything else in an entirely new light. This union appears to be synonymous with the point vierge, The place in which we experience God is that which unites us to God and everyone else, along with the arrival at a loving knowledge for others. This is a gift that we approach via meditation and prayer. These practices can help facilitate our own realization that while life is nothing but a struggle to seek truth, that truth is something we already possess, though one cannot simply open their eyes and see. Put differently, to approach the divine spark that unites us in love, Merton maintains that we must engage in disciplines to break through the shell of the false self and to continue digging. To accomplish this, our prayer and meditation must be accompanied by a critical self-examination to root out the prejudices, propaganda, biases, and falsehoods that we hold because of our participation in the pseudo-religion of mass society. We enter into the messiness of life, the complexity, the grayness, and we must learn to accept, indeed to choose, Merton says, the evident impossibility of giving everything a clear, definitive meaning. The process is not easy, Merton acknowledges, but in our divestment, we are practicing renunciation. The contemplative, including non-monastics, must renounce something, whether that means accepting the everyday routine of work, poverty, hardship, and monotony that characterizes the lives of all of us, or just living more frugally or simply. Sanctity, the holiness that accompanies our being our true self, depends on renunciation, detachment, self-denial. Some renunciation we can do alone, by giving up our deliberate faults and imperfections, obvious sins, and things that are evidently wrong. But we also need to renounce all our unconscious attachments to created things and to our own will and desires, which can only be done with the help of God and others, who reveal to us that which we are unaware of, but which needs purified. Of course, it is an unpleasant and uncomfortable task, but Merton asserts, you were not created for pleasure, you were created for spiritual joy, the joy of liberation from pseudo-religion. These renunciations are part of a process of conversion. We reach new levels of truth and new understandings of God's will, but we also leave behind certain things and sometimes people in those conversions as we achieve new stages constituted by new values. Merton warns against renunciation and conversions that lead to resentment. Of course, renouncing resentment does not mean an acceptance of the mass society, but rather an ever deeper engagement in the contemplation that allows for the purifying self-criticism that permits one to turn outwards toward the world in love. As we have those experiences of unity within ourselves and the love of God, we are gifted a joy that is given to, as Merton says, overflow from our souls and help others to rejoice in God. From contemplation, then, it is the experience of love that is the deepest law of nature to which we are inclined and by which we are fulfilled. Consider also Merton's thoughts on nonviolence. Our attempts to assist others in their own journey toward inner integration will be fruitless without deepening our own self-understanding, freedom, integrity, and capacity to love. Dangers abound here, as it will also be no small jolt to our neighbor when we point out the falsehoods they hold and the faults that they have habituated. But as with the development of our own selves in contemplation, it is a practice in service of truth. We renounce untruth to facilitate conversion, and we must assist our neighbors in doing the same. Yet we lead with love. Merton writes, in the long run, no one can show another the error that is within him unless the other is convinced that his critic first sees and loves the good that is within him. As long as we do not have this love, we have no real access to truth. Our work then with others can take the form of relationship or witness by which we encourage others to participate similarly in this process. Merton argues that this integration of the self and overcoming existing estrangement is essentially a practice of truth, which for Merton via Gandhi is the way of peace, the law of our being. Lies, on the other hand, bring violence and disorder. Our commitment to truth in violence, Merton says, seeks the salvation and redemption of the opponent, not his castigation, humiliation, and defeat. It strives to operate without hatred, without hostility, and without resentment. And this is key. Our conversions are not at the expense of those who think differently from us. Our renunciation of those former falsehoods is not to spur on estrangement. Instead, our progress toward truth includes bringing others with us, which requires that we talk about truth. Our spiritual unity depends on our working together to dissipate the more absurd fictions held by both of us, which make unity impossible. And to achieve this, Merton warns, you must be willing, if necessary, to become a disturbing and therefore an undesired person, one who is not wanted because he upsets the general dream. Let me conclude then by briefly raising three considerations drawn from our discussion here. Note that these are by no means exhaustive, but just beginnings. First, the recent discussions of communities that can broadly be described as rural, working class, and white, especially in the era of Donald Trump, have made much more complex the understanding of a community that society at large might prefer to forget. Merton's own understanding of the human person and the impossibility of strangerhood adds to this complexity and delineates a new obligation in our relationship to these communities. In light of Merton's thought, not to mention considerations of the Imago Dei, we must affirm that the now infamous quote regarding very fine people on both sides is true, as much as it might pain us to accept that. Of course, the man who spoke those words did not intend it in the way that we who are gathered here would likely intend it, but we can recognize that all of us are much more complex than we might wish to be, even those we would consider others. Recall the words of Martin Luther King Jr. We must recognize that the evil deed of the enemy neighbor, the thing that hurts, never quite expresses all that he is. An element of goodness may be found even in our worst enemy. As well, there is some good in the worst of us and some evil in the best of us. When we discover this, we are less prone to hate our enemies. In a word, they and we are complex and contradictory people. Second, and flowing from point one, is that our first task is for us. We are called to first dispel the myths we cling to and cultivate love. We cannot remove the splinter from their eye without first removing the beam from our own. And even more challenging is recognizing that if we are to engage in the self-purification that Merton prescribes by the method he lays out, we must even sometimes allow others to remove the beam for us. It is not a race to rightness, a mere flipping of the power structures, but in a Benedictine fashion, a competition in obedience and humility. Conversion is a process of life, not a point in life. As such, when we reach new insights, the process is not concluded. Instead, we must continue to learn from those away from whom we have grown. Like emergence theory, our goal is not necessarily to convince others to think like us, but to together achieve new levels of truth and love, contributed to by all parties. Third, and finally, we must remember that we can only do so much. Merton's process is not a sure path. Grace is required. Le point vierge is not something we go to, but something into which we are drawn, something we are gifted. And in our attempts to dispel myths and falsehoods in those who we love, in an attempt to not become estranged from them or to create new strangers, not only may we not be believed, but we may be despised, or God forbid, disposed of. This is the risk to which Christ's disciples are called. It is a participation in the formation of ourselves and the formation of our communities, but a limited participation. In the end, we must let God do God's work. Only in the fullness and completion that God brings about can we once and for all dispel strangerhood. Thank you.